Kitty. Thank you for joining us for Consent Dojo. How are you doing this new year?
I am doing pretty well. I've got my cup of tea and I fed the cats. So all is well.
Great. Let's see. And there's live transcription available for those of you who would like live transcription. And when this goes on YouTube, it will also have the little subtitles, and we'll see if the AI will be able to translate and transcribe us well. So Happy New Year. And it seemed like a good thing this year for Consent Dojo to start with how to be a really good human being. And I totally lured and baited you into. Now, before I launch into that, okay, would you introduce yourself? We know your work and efforts around consent culture in our little cauldron that is San Francisco and sex positive, but many others might not. So go for it.
Sure. I also want to acknowledge that the video and audio is a little bit choppy here and there. I'll be doing my best to restate questions. So a little bit about me. I'm Kitty Stryker. I use she, her pronouns. I live in the Bay Area. I've also lived in London, England for a while. And I've been doing consent culture work for about 12 years or something now. I've been very active in the kink community in my 20s, and I felt like there was a lot of conversations being had about consent in that community, but there was also some areas that were kind of lacking, like thinking about how people's ability to consent can be impacted by their environment, by their identity, by the types of dynamics they're in. And so I wanted to create this idea of consent culture as a way to move forward into something rather than just talking about how to avoid rape culture, how to avoid abuse, but to talk about well, what can we do that's better? Like, what's the alternative and how do we focus on that? And that has been a guiding principle for me for the last 12 years. I put out a book that was an anthology called Ask, Building Consent Culture. That was a diverse group of writers. I tried to focus my energy on finding people who were more marginalized and didn't always have a voice in these conversations. And yeah, I did that. And then later this year, in June of this year, my book, workbook, Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook, is going to be coming out through Thorntree Press. And it's a bunch of prompts. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those prompts are and how that looks later. But yeah, so that's me. That's what I've been doing.
Yay. Also, for the viewers, we have a big storm coming in, and which is affecting, I believe, my Wi-Fi situation. So I may be sounding choppy. How am I now?
Good right now.
Okay. All right. I am on my hotspot. Also, I would love it if any of the attendees would do a quick test for us in the chat as well as a Q&A. Tell us where you're from or how you heard about this, or just say hi so I can test out the chat. Thank you. Hello from Michigan. Great.
Hi.
And let's see if we can get somebody in, pop something in the Q&A.
Yay, hi everybody. Wow, that's a diverse group of people from all over. That's awesome.
Hamburg, excellent.
Okay, and it looks like the Q&A. Yes.
Thank you.
Testing the Q&A. The Q&A works. Fantastic. Right. Thanks, everybody.
Technical check. Great. So I'm going to apologize in advance because we are on the eve of a massive flooding. So if I get choppy, Kitty, you just take it away and talk, all right?
Absolutely, no problem.
So let's get back to the question of, I did the annoying thing of posing to you how to be a really good human, and what does that have to do with consent? Because I think it does.
Yeah, well, so I did that annoying thing that I always do, which is, well, what does good mean? And I realized while I was thinking about that question and doing some research on that question of what is goodness, what defines good, I started going back into my ethics classes from like 15 years ago. And I didn't remember that much of it, to be honest. Like I remembered some basic stuff, but different philosophers have always had different ideas of what goodness was, whether that be a utilitarian idea about goodness or a religious idea about goodness. Some people believe that goodness is inherent. Some people believe that goodness is earned. So it's really complicated. And I think that's actually a really beautiful place to start, because I think that our society tends to try to construct this idea of goodness and rightness as infallible truths that everyone would agree on. And they're not. They're very relational. They have a lot to do with how you were raised, who you know, what identities you might hold, your position in society. Uh, just there's so many different things that can impact what you consider to be good or what you consider to be right. As someone who was raised pagan, my ideas of goodness and rightness are very different from other people's. I don't consider sexuality to be sinful, for example, which some people do. I don't believe that stealing to feed your family is bad. I think that's actually a good thing. And a lot of people would disagree with me. So I think it's interesting. I guess, what does good mean to you?
I would agree with you about the contextual, and perhaps to simplify it, good. Yeah, it is a big philosophical question, right?
It
So
is.
because it is a big philosophical question, and for thoughtful and kind people, and for ordinary folks, I think most of us want to be good, whatever that means. And once we start diving into it, into the deep end, it can be mind-boggling. So then how about a few simple things to get us started? And that was
Yeah.
really what got me into this question of, okay, here we are in a new year. It's one of those times when people make resolutions, but what if it were just something like, let's be good? And something that we can reflect on, that maybe we can engage in every day to be just a little more good. And that's the whole thing also with Consent Dojo, is the daily small practice of engaging in agreement making, because consent is not easy. And for those of you who've been following Consent Dojo, and there's all the episodes, I mean, this is number 20, okay?
Hmm.
So it's been going on for 20 months, and oh goodness, it is nuanced, it is simple, and yet difficult,
Yeah.
yet also complex. So simple and not easy. But what if we just had a few things? And a few things to just even think about. We don't even have to be good at it, of at least striving towards goodness.
Well, actually, I would add, for me, that is intrinsic to my idea of goodness, is the willingness to evolve and change. I think of someone as being good if they are willing to take on other people's thoughts, feelings, opinions, new data, new science, being open um, to those new ideas and being open to being wrong and wanting to strive to improve is a part of goodness. I see goodness as something that is an active process not as an ideal to achieve, much in the same way as I see consent. Consent is about action, it's about thoughtfulness, it's about intent to some extent, but not exclusively. And I think having it be something that we are moving towards
Mm.
takes some of the pressure off too. Cause like I'm not perfect at this and I've been working on this for 12 years. So like that should give you some reassurance that like, hey, I have conversations about consent and boundary violations all the time. And that's okay because we're humans, we're fallible. It's about striving to do better.
Okay. And since I gave you the challenge of come up with 5 thoughts or 5 ways to be a good human, let's start going through those.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the first one?
So the first one that I wanted to talk about that I think has been probably the best daily practice for consent, but also for just being a decent human is asking if somebody wants advice, sympathy, or just to be heard. There are so many arguments on Facebook that could be avoided if you just ask the person, would you like advice? Would you like sympathy? Or do you just want to be heard? Um, so it's something I'm still practicing. I love to give advice. And so I have to really rein myself back and see if that's something that that person is even looking for, because they might not be. They might
Mhm.
just be complaining, which is okay. So having that stepping back and seeing, giving other people agency to ask for what they want and to sometimes even think about what it is they want is a helpful first step.
I remember, I don't remember when or who, but I remember the sensation years ago when somebody first asked me that. And I think I must have been about upset about something. It obviously was somebody who was like one of my closest friends. And years ago, whoever that was, bless them, asked, do you want me to listen? Or do you want me to help you? Or do you want me to do something else? And I remember, because I was an adult before
Mhm.
anybody asked that, because, well, cultural upbringing, uh, one side Japan, the other, one side Japan, a little bit of German, and then America. So not, there's a lot of assumptions in these cultures and a lot of ways. I'd never been asked that. And I remember, I don't remember how old I was, but I was definitely an adult, pausing and going, oh, I get a choice. And it was a
Yeah.
distinct sensation. And even just hearing that from another meant, oh, you actually care, and I get a choice. And yeah, that was huge. To this day, I will start off, like if I'm just venting, I will just open with, I'm venting, y'all.
Yeah. That is also an important part of this, I think. It is, if you can manage it, it's really good to say, I am looking for advice, or I'm looking for this kind of advice. Because, if that is something that you're looking for, there are people who will be very tentative to give it to you if, that they think that might not be what you like. Because of course, I can't be the only person who's offered advice to someone who didn't want it, and that person's been very upset, and I've been like, oh no, I was really just trying to help. I should have asked you. So there's
Okay,
like responsibility for both, I think, of like making sure to advocate for yourself, but also, checking in first.
so let me play devil's advocate,
Yep.
or the advocate of the common practice of the world. Well, if you got a problem and you've just been venting about your problem, why are you upset that I offered you advice? I'm helping you. What's your problem?
Well, I would say that first, I would say, because I'm like way too Californian now, I'm originally from Massachusetts. I was much more hardcore then. But now I would say, I can tell that you want to help me, and that's awesome. That makes me feel really great and really loved. The thing is, you don't have all of the information. So the advice that you're giving me, while well-intentioned, doesn't have all of the facts. And I might not be comfortable giving you, or especially the internet, all of the facts that weighs into why this is a problem. So the best thing you could do to help me out right now is to just hear me and say, that sounds like that sucks, you know? And I think that I try to remember, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about believing in people's good intentions, but like, I generally think when people offer advice, it's because they're giving me their offering in a way to help me. And while sometimes I might bristle at that, sometimes I'm not ready for advice. I cannot tell you how many bad relationships I have been in where somebody's giving me the advice to just dump them because clearly this person's making me miserable and I'm not ready to hear it. And it doesn't matter how correct you are. If you're not ready, you're not ready. So it can just end up being frustrating for both parties.
Mm-hmm. And the sense I also get to is to be heard is that the person will be with me in my experience now.
Yes.
Giving me advice is they want me to look to the future.
Yeah.
And maybe I can't look to the future, and future might be tomorrow, right? I can't look to the future until I've released some of the tension or feel that I have been understood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because advice from someone who doesn't really understand you, as someone mentioned in the chat about, sometimes that person has a privileged position that they might not be aware of, but that makes it feel really unhelpful. Like, oh, I've definitely heard, like, I've said something about how it's really frustrating to still be considered an emerging writer, even though I've been writing for 20 years. I could feel my eye twitching as I say that. And I have had well-meaning men say, well, like, you should just take advantage of that. Like, put yourself out there more, use that as a jumping off point. And it's because they don't necessarily have that experience of being undervalued as a female writer, as a queer writer. And so, like, I get what they mean. I get that they're like, just put yourself out there more, but they're not necessarily aware of all of the things that stand in the way of that. And so that advice, while I think they mean it genuinely, is kind of a F you to me. And like, oh, you're not trying hard enough. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Just try harder and you'll get there. It's like, that's not always true. Sometimes there's things beyond your control.
And all right, this might be going down a rabbit hole and you might be addressing this later. I don't know.
That's
But
okay.
The unsolicited advice giving, okay, so the unsolicited advice giving sometimes is from a genuinely good intention, but sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's about establishing a pecking order, an authority,
Yeah.
even intimidation. It's the, well, actually, like,
Yeah.
I'm sure neither of us have ever heard the, well, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've always been an anarchist, and had issues with authority anyway, and then hearing stuff like that has been a thorn in my side for most of my life. It can feel really invalidating, and it can be really difficult if you think this person is trying to help. Sometimes your desire to believe in the good intentions of that other person masks their not so great intentions towards you. So it's just better all around, I think, to just ask for what you need and check in with somebody to see what they're asking for before you offer it. Make sure that your offering is graciously accepted.
So your first point of being a good human in 2023 and forward is ask the person if they want advice, sympathy, or just to be heard. and to also ask ourselves, do I want advice? Do I want sympathy, or do I want to be heard? And when it's not a match, that we can actually make a correction.
Yeah, I would add one other thing. Before you give advice or sympathy, but mostly advice, ask yourself, to what end? I plan on getting "to what end" tattooed on my body because I say this all the time. If I feel the temptation to tell somebody what I think they should be doing, I stop myself and I say, to what end do I want to do this? And how am I going to feel if they don't follow my advice? If I'm going to be upset that they aren't listening to me, it's probably not a good time for me to be offering advice, because that is no longer about the other person. That's about my desire for control. So that has been a very important part of that for me.
Can we role play this where I'm like the person that's like in distress,
Sure.
and then maybe you can also do a little asides of what it is that you're analyzing.
Sure.
Okay, so let's see. I come to your place and I'm like, oh my God, kidding. Oh my God, 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 oh my God. I got another rejection from another another editor and publisher rejected me. Okay.
Oh, no. I would first say, that sounds really difficult. Would you like a cup of tea? Because I did spend 4 years in England. So that's how we solve everything.
Oh my God, a cuppa would be lovely, but oh
Okay.
my God, it's like my 576 rejection.
That sounds really, really hard. You seem really upset about that. Here's your cup of tea. Uh, would you like to have some advice, or do you want sympathy, or do you just want to vent about it for right now?
Um, 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 okay, I'm gonna go for the advice one. Okay, I think because we're both in the writing biz, I'd like some advice.
Okay, great. Well, I can give you some advice now, and you can also hit me up later if there's other aspects that you think of that you're like, oh, it'd be really helpful if I knew a little bit more about this. Here's a Kleenex, and here's some cream and sugar. um, yeah. So first of all, rejections happen. It sucks. It's painful. I cannot tell you how many rejections I've had, but it's really important to self-regulate, take some deep breaths, and realize that it is not a rejection of you as a person. It is a rejection of this particular iteration of your work. So that would be an example of advice that I would give that's addressing what I would see as the first issue, which is, I have been rejected and it hurts. So I would say, okay, well, how can I help address that hurt and like take some of the sting out of that? And that would be my first bit of advice.
So the to what end is the taking the sting out.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
well, I mean, kind of selfishly, I'm a little bit uncomfortable when someone's crying in my apartment. So my selfish inclination is, how do I get this person to stop crying so that they can vocally tell me what's going on in a calm fashion?
Hey, and that's actually also part of being a good person, right? Understanding how you're reacting to another person's situation.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in de-escalation for that reason, so that I've learned how to regulate my own feelings in an emotional, stressful situation, so that I can check in with myself and say, I also need a cup of tea in order to have this conversation. Um, I find that for me, a cup of tea is a very helpful prop, because I can stop and have a sip of tea as a way to collect my thoughts and remind myself, don't start figuring out what my next thing that I'm going to say is while they're talking.
I just realized also another nifty thing about a beverage, because it's also in Japan too.
Mhm.
By the way, I love your coffee cup.
Thank you.
To have a sip requires taking a breath.
Yes. Yeah. And it's important, I think. So that's a way to do the sympathy. It's a comfort thing, I think, for me. Um, Also, I wanted to say, one of the things that I've learned to do is to say, you can hit me up about more of this later, because you might not be in a state right now to think of all the questions you want to ask, but I am open to you following up.
I noticed you said that. I really liked it. All right. So number one, on how to be a good person is asking if that other person wants advice, sympathy, or just to be heard, including understanding that about yourself, and to what end. What's
Mhm.
the next point? Number two.
So the next point I wanted to talk about, now I've been in the activist community for a long time as well, general different types of activism, but there's this concept in community organizing about stepping up versus stepping back. Now, we live in a society that's very vocally concerned about fairness, this belief that everybody deserves a chance to speak and that we should all have equal time and space. I believe in that as an ideal. However, I also recognize that we aren't always aware of the space that we take up. We also aren't always aware of the space we're not taking up. We don't always recognize that we've been reticent to speak on something, or that we don't feel comfortable saying something in the moment. So I think checking in with ourselves to reflect on how much we're talking in a given conversation, we can then decide if we should step up, speak up more, volunteer more, or if maybe we should step back and let other people come in and fill that space that we're leaving. One example of this, I get asked to speak at conferences every once in a while, and I've started making an effort to say no, because as a white cis woman, I get to speak a lot. So I don't just say no, I say, here's 5 other people that I think you should ask instead, who would be excellent at speaking on this topic, who are more marginalized and don't get these opportunities as often. And by making that choice to step back so that these other people can step forward, I am inviting people to take up the space that I'm leaving behind.
Now, so you were talking about being a white cis female and ergo the privilege of it and opportunities, right?
Mhm.
So we're also getting into the realm of power dynamics in the everyday life.
Yeah, and I think I know some people bristle at the idea of privilege, because you can have certain social privileges and also certain lacks. Like, I am privileged in being cis and white. I have less privilege in being female and queer and disabled. Um, but they don't necessarily like negate each other. Like, I can occupy all of those complicated spaces at the same time. So, one thing I thought was really interesting when I was noodling about this is there's the subconscious belief that women talk a lot, right? There's this idea that like women are constantly talking, we talk to each other, we're taking up so much space with all of our talking. But they have done so many studies on this where men will say, oh, women took up so much space in that conversation talking. And they find that actually the men have taken up most of the space. They're just not aware that they're doing that. They genuinely believe that women have taken up more space than them, while simultaneously taking up most of the space. I think that's a really interesting checkpoint for reflecting on what are we doing in any given moment, right?
That's going to be a tough one for having self-awareness. What's a small step towards knowing when to start a step on knowing when to step up and step back? Because that's some big stuff about understanding social dynamics in the environment in the moment.
Yeah, I think it can be really complicated. One small step, if I've noticed myself getting out of breath because I'm clearly talking too much, I try to ask a question to somebody else who I notice hasn't been talking as much, and says, what do you think about this? When we talk about this thing, when we talk about stepping up versus stepping back. What does that bring up for you? How does that feel for you? Do you have an experience of that?
Let's see. So how would this work for, let's say there's a group of people and somebody is not stepping back and the others are noticing. How do you adjust that?
I think it depends on the dynamics of that social group. Like if it's a casual, I play a lot of D&D. I'll give that as an example, right? And I play D&D with a lot of very excitable nerds. And we all want to be in the spotlight 100% of the time. We're all very keen. And so if I notice that someone has been taking up a lot of the game, we play on Zoom or we play on Discord. So I might message them privately and say, hey, I'm finding it hard to get a word in edgewise. And that's a way for me to privately sort of signal, hey, can you give me some space here? Like give me an opening here without like doing that publicly. Of course, that's not going to work if you are at an organizing meeting. I'm a dork. I will raise my hand because people recognize that and will be like, oh, okay, yes, Kitty. And everyone will laugh because it feels like, oh, we're not in school anymore. But it is like so ingrained in us that someone is raising their hand because they have something to say that we will then stop someone or we will stop to ask that person, oh, what do you have to say?
So you're able to raise your hand and step up, but how about the people who are not stepping up? Maybe they're aware that they're not stepping up, or maybe they're not aware that they're not taking space.
I think in certain conversations, again, this is more coming from organizing space. So maybe if you can give me a different example, I can try to explain what I would do in that situation. But having a moderator is really helpful because then it is one person's responsibility to figure that out. And then they can kind of make sure that everybody's getting their chance. And, I think sometimes you say, hey, do you person over here have anything to say on that? And that person will say, no, I'm good. And you say, okay, you're giving them the agency to step in. They don't necessarily have to want to. And that's okay.
Let's see, I'm trying to come up with a social example because like an activist organization has certain amount of structure.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, in theory.
In theory, but the language of structure, and a group of friends saying, well, you be the moderator would sound a little weird. So what about, say, a group of friends and trying to make a decision of what movie to see?
Well, I think I'm usually the outspoken person in a lot of groups of people. So I will say, okay, let's take a vote. Here's 3 suggestions. What do you guys think of those 3 things?
How do you notice when somebody's not making themselves available there? Because a person who's not speaking up or stepping up may have an amazing, brilliant solution or suggestion. And we lose the input from the brilliant and quiet person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I will sometimes, a lot of my introverted friends will be on their phones a lot during these kinds of conversations. So I might text them and just say, hey, thumbs up, thumbs down. How are we doing? Is there anything I can do to help you out right now? And then that way, again, I think sometimes that can help address the shyness that comes from like, I'm not sure that I want to get everyone's attention on me. But I might have something to say. Or I look at body language a lot. If I notice that someone is sitting forward and engaged, but they're not saying anything, they're still actively a part of the conversation. If I notice someone sitting back or like folding their arms, if they're not mirroring other people's body language and they're kind of withdrawing, then I would gently nudge in some way to be like, hey, how's it going? Maybe I'd take them aside privately, like at a party, and I'd say, hey, I just want to check in. Are you doing okay? You know, because I think that sometimes body language is more communicative than somebody's words. I wouldn't take one or the other as 100% all of the time. I always try to pay attention to both.
When I'm teaching, and whether it's online or in person, and there's, speaking of excitable, there'll be somebody who's, excitable and want to talk and share, and maybe this is the first time they've been able to talk about their desires or be in a place that's welcoming. And I get that, but they can also may not be aware that they are stepping up too much. So I've encountered this thing of, all right, how do I get them to back up without saying, yo, step back? What I have done, and it seemed to be so far somewhat effective, is I'd love to hear from those who haven't had a chance to speak. I welcome those. Let's give space for folks whose idea we haven't heard yet. So if I'm saying, for those of you who come to my classes, if you hear me say, hey, can I hear from the folks who I haven't heard from? It is an invitation for somebody to give space to others. And I'm hoping that that's good enough that the person out there with a good idea will feel welcome to speak.
Yeah, I also really like when I do workshops on consent culture stuff, I often have an anonymous Google form that they can fill out. So that way they can ask questions anonymously throughout the conversation. And I'll give a deadline of like, okay, at 6 p.m., I'm going to close this form so that we have time to go through the questions. But then that way you can ask an anonymous question. Because I guess a lot of my strategies are about not drawing too much attention to someone, because I used to immediately be like, hey, person over there, what do you think? And everyone would turn and look at them and they would just shrink back like, oh no, the teacher's asked me for the answer to the math problem and I have no idea. So I'm like trying to learn to not do that because that can also be alarming.
I like the use of the technology there. I need to borrow that from you. So the second advice in being a good human is about learning about stepping up versus stepping back and the various conditions in it. So noticing, a lot of it's noticing on that, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and asking for clarification, rather than assuming that somebody is withdrawn because they don't feel heard or they don't feel invested. Maybe they just got a text and they're really focused on that right now. Like, you don't know. And so rather than coming in and going, oh no, oh God, are you okay? Like, don't try to save somebody. Because again, that's kind of putting the focus on you and control. A lot of this is about releasing control and surrendering to an experience, which has been my 2022 goal.
I there have been several occasions where attendees to my event, and especially if there's somebody who's come frequently, or they have self-knowledge, will pull me aside before one of my workshops and tell me that, hey, and I remember one particular person saying that I don't pick up social cues. Let me know if I'm talking too much. And so we had a deal, and this on a specific occasion I'm thinking of, it was on Zoom, so I could send a little DM and say, give some space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was so nice that they had the self-awareness to know that they're not always self-aware.
Yeah. I've actually had that arrangement with roommates when they're having sex. We had like if you get an emoji of this type of emoji, it means I can hear you, please quiet down. And so rather than knocking on the door, which again can feel really jarring, it can put the other person in an awkward position who doesn't necessarily know me. I just send a little text, like I usually send a little winky face, and they'll be like, ah, okay, I should, all right. And it's like that way it's playful and it's not disciplinary, which I think is also really important.
Nice. So stepping up versus stepping back. You got a third one for me?
Yes. So one of the things that we had talked about was the art of the genuine apology. And apologies are so they again, like consent, like goodness, it seems so simple until you start trying to define it. And then it starts to get a lot more complicated. Um, Different people care about different aspects of an apology, for example, which is something I'd never really thought about. I had always thought that everybody needed the same things from an apology that I need. And then I realized that that wasn't true. So I guess I'd start with, what does an apology look like for you, Midori?
Okay, so it would start with, it actually includes the word apology. And there's a situation that I have had in my art business side where it was a gallerist mishandling some of my work. I was not happy.
Yeah.
Communications went unanswered, and I finally sent a upset, and I said, I am upset, in an email. What I got back was a lot of explanation as to why they had no bandwidth. I found that was even more upsetting.
Yeah.
Now, had that all the reasons why, and they were all legitimate, but the acknowledgement at the beginning, hey, I know that I haven't been answering your email, and this has been frustrating for you. I apologize. I needed that.
Yeah.
And I never got that.
Yeah, that can be really important. Um, I think for me, like a thorough apology, I know I must sound like I live this extremely structured life. I can blame it on being a Capricorn, I guess. But like I want to hear what that person did wrong, what they should have done instead, acknowledgement of the impact, how their mistake impacted me, and then what the plan is with actionable points to prevent this from happening again. I want it to be something that I can hold someone to. So, not like, I'll never make you feel bad again, because I don't know what that means. That's completely amorphous. But when you send me a message, I will get back to you within 3 hours, barring catastrophe. That is an actionable thing that I can hold someone to.
Actually, the structure of apology, I'm snickering because I have actually used the demand of that structure of apology as a way to counter troll a FetLife troll.
And
yeah,
I could see it.
FetLife troll said something stupid, and I essentially, it was a really dumb, sexist, colonialist thing of this dude said, oh, Japanese women are so submissive.
I twitch.
I'm like, okay, here we go. My favorite sport, counter trolling. So then I said, apologize. Don't ever say that again about any group of people. And you need to apologize. And he came back with, well, I don't know what I've done wrong, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I said, 1, you apologize. 2, you acknowledge. And I actually went through that structure. And then I even I was being such a smart ass because it's a sport for me. I even put in like links to understanding colonialism. And so that you are to do all of these things. And like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I see above.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, there's, for the viewers, I also want to refer to an earlier episode on the art of apology with S. Bear Bergman that I had on Consent Dojo. I believe it was episode 10. Oh yes, episode 10, the apology, the good, the bad, and the restorative, featuring S. Bear Bergman. So I'll be putting that link below, and Mr. Greg has also put that into the chat. So take a look for those of you who are live.
Yeah, I also appreciate the Leather Lioness put in the apology languages quiz. Now I want to add, I do love the love languages and the apology languages thing. Gary Chapman is a little bit complicated. He's a Christian relationship coach, I guess. I don't think he's a trained therapist. And so like it's important to have that context for his work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get some good stuff out of it, even if you have to kind of eye askance a little at the like cishet whiteness of it. It's still useful. When I was looking up like what makes a proper apology, you know, there's that sort of his 5 types of apology. But I also saw expression of regret, explanation of what went wrong, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, offer of repair, and request for forgiveness. Now, what I think is interesting, I don't care about a request for forgiveness at all. That does not matter to me. I don't need to be forgiven when I've done wrong either. Because to me, it's about the action, it's about the behavior, it's about proving that you understand what you did and that you have a plan to make sure it doesn't happen again. Forgiveness is, again, sort of, to me, an amorphous thing. But there are other people who really need to hear that they are forgiven, or that, you know, they really need to tell you that they forgive you. That's an important part of their process. So having some idea about what that might look like for someone that you're in relationship with is really important.
The art of the apology, and given the variation of what individuals need and what individuals believe that they are providing, spanning that gap can be a challenge. I come from,
Especially in the moment.
yeah, especially in the moment. And then when there's a cross-culturalness of it. So for coming from Japan, like if you look at the Japanese government, a formal apology, and then they continue doing whatever bullshit that they're doing.
Mhm.
Nothing gets done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, okay, then what did that mean? It didn't mean anything because you're continuing to do the thing.
Or if I'm talking to my lovely Canadian friends, then, and sorry is merely a declaration of friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was living in England, I bumped into someone else and they apologized to me. And I was just like, what is this? Like, what is happening here? I think that that's also really important, though, because, like, for example, sorry you feel that way does use the word sorry, but it's not really an apology.
Mhm.
And even again, even if you genuinely mean that you are sorry that your actions have caused them to feel a certain way, like that was not your intention, and you feel bad about it, it doesn't matter because that's culturally such a constantly used way to invalidate someone that nobody wants to hear it.
Right. And then there's the I've had this friction as well when you know, let's say somebody stubbed their toe and they're ouch, and then oh, I'm sorry. And then they turn around and say, well, you didn't do it. Why are you sorry? I'm like, uh, oh, I compassion.
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly.
this different use of the word sorry, sorry that's weaponized, sorry that is camaraderie, sorry that is a national character. Hey, Canadians. Um, sorry that is a national excuse. Hey, Japanese. And yeah, the weaponized sorry. And then there's the,
I would say is American.
yeah, sorry you feel that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's used so often, even in like leftist activist circles. This whole like, oh, I'm sorry that you were too sensitive is like,
I,
are
I,
you?
I apologize. What's your problem? I'm sorry that you're upset. See, I'm apologizing. What's your problem?
Yeah. And it's a way to take accountability away from you onto somebody else. This is actually, incidentally, sidebar, one of my major frustrations with the Four Agreements, which is like a sort of self-helpy book that talks about different aspects of being in relationship with each other. One of the Four Agreements is nothing other people do is because of you. It's because of their own experience and their own trauma. And I was like, that's not necessarily true. Like, if I punch someone in the face and they're upset at me, that is because of me. I did that. Like, like, I don't think we can go through life being so individualistic as to believe that other people's feelings are entirely their responsibility and never influenced by anything outside of them. That's absurd.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think that that means that you can control how other people feel either. I think there's a balance. And I think that we tend to be like, we are attracted to these very simplistic ways of looking at it in the hopes that we can figure out the formula and do it right forever. But people are more complicated than that. Goodness is relative, consent is complicated. Apologies are wonky at times, and you're not always going to get it right.
And speaking of complicated, when in the hell do we get a chance to practice being a good, genuine, graceful apologizer? I mean, we do the best we can in the moment, and the apologies, especially in the moment, right? And so much of it is based on how fucked up your family of origin or upbringing. And however it was that we were mistrained, if you will. And like I'm thinking of the situation with the gallerist.
Yeah.
And whatever structure that they learned how to face a situation where they've done harm, and my expectation of it. Neither of us have practice, and I'm generalizing this as well. How many of us have practice on we get to practice how to learn how to ride a bike. We get to practice putting on makeup. We get to practice about all sorts of things. But we don't get to practice how to apologize.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of that, I think, comes down to the ways we're taught to be defensive. That if we cause someone harm, we need to reflexively defend ourselves from being rejected, from being ostracized, from being shamed. And we're so afraid of that we are afraid to take responsibility, because we're afraid that that's going to mean that we're canceled and like we're banished from community forever. There's this disposability, I think, that comes with that ends up being really irresponsible. It doesn't teach anybody anything. And I will fully admit, I was one of those people in my 20s. I very much was like, no, if you've messed up, then that's it. Like, and then I realized, well, I want a certain level of grace when I mess up. Maybe I should be expanding that out to other people, like, and giving them a chance to show that they could do better.
I have a fantasy of somebody far more qualified than myself to run an apology lab, apology practice space with all sorts of situations. Maybe someday. So
well, I wanted to give a quick anecdote of, I used this when I ran a sex party in London. So we had a code of conduct, and people would sometimes violate something on the code of conduct, not something egregious, but something that was like, we need you to step back and like check yourself. And I genuinely did not think, I had been to a lot of sex parties. I had never been to one where that kind of process was in place. It was usually the host would listen to two people and then make a decision on who was right and who was wrong. Judge and jury, done, a verdict was made. Instead, we started doing this thing where we would say, like, okay, which point in the code of conduct did you mess up on? What should you have done instead? What are you going to do next time? Before you can come back to our party, we need you to write an essay on this. And I did not think that British people were going to write an essay on accountability to come to a sex party. Like, I just didn't think that was going to happen. But people did. And not only did people write essays, but they would say, you know, after working on this, I realized I'm not ready to be in this kind of space. So I'm going to go work on myself and I'm going to come back when I think I'm more ready. And I was absolutely flummoxed. I did not expect that at all. So
Wow.
sometimes you will be surprised at how this can give people the opportunity to take a step back for themselves and be like, oh, I didn't realize how this came across. And now that I've thought about it, I really am sorry. I'm maybe more sorry now than I was when it first happened. So I like to give people that space.
I might hit you up for that process for on the times that I might be throwing a party. So
Absolutely.
I want to take a quick moment to, speaking of step back and step up, to see if there are any questions. I see the chat going on nicely, and the Canadians are leading this in terms of a good apology action going on there. Are there any, what questions do you have for us? And you can put it in the chat or you can put it in the Q&A, either's fine. And giving it a moment here. And I welcome any of you to put that in as I move on to the next, because we talked about the art of the genuine apology. And so what's our fourth one?
The fourth one actually fits in really well with this, which is the graceful benefit of the doubt. I think you picked the phrasing of that, but it's definitely something that I practice a lot on Twitter all the time. I used to get wrapped up in a lot of arguments on Twitter because it is a cesspool and perfect for getting into arguments. Recently, there was a young woman who said something on Twitter that came across as a very sex worker phobic attitude about pornography and its impact on relationships. And I had seen that a couple of people I knew in the, alternative sexual communities of various kinds had commented on this, a bit like, how dare you say this? Like, that's not right. Like, you shouldn't be putting this on people, etc. And I said something to that effect, but then I was like, hang on, unless this is being said in good faith. And if it is being said in good faith, I would love to talk to you more about this to understand a bit more where you're coming from. And she messaged me privately. We had a nice long conversation, and I realized that she was not a sex worker phobic, radical feminist type, that she was not against the adult industry or against BDSM or against any of those things, but she had seen an impact in her personal life of young men who didn't necessarily have the skills to contextualize some of the stuff that they were seeing, who then didn't know how to communicate that to a partner and have like an appropriate conversation about it before an action was happening. So like, various sex acts happening during an intimate encounter without checking in before you do it, just assuming that this thing would be okay. I don't want to get too explicit because this will go up on Facebook eventually, but I think people get the idea of like, you consent to intercourse, and then that person thinks that means also tying you up, and you didn't have that conversation, but that person saw it in porn a lot, and so they assumed that would be okay, or like, if you would allow this, then this.
A very real example, and I've had a similar conversation, and I don't want to go too much down this rabbit hole, but that because of and pornography, there's trends like anything, and recent trend in porn, at least in Western porn, is intercourse and hand around the throat.
That's a great example. Yeah.
And that's been very common. And I am hearing about how that's assumed to be what generally hetero lads assuming that that is what the gals want.
Hmm.
And the gals going along with it because that's what they think they're supposed to like.
Yeah, exactly. And so I found by having this conversation with this young woman, I was able to validate some of her feelings and say, I absolutely agree with you. I've been in the adult industry, and I do think that the adult industry has some responsibility to educate people appropriately on some of these things. Also, our culture has a responsibility to not rely on pornography to be sexual education. Both of those things can be true. And it was so awesome for her to feel validated and for me to feel validated. And nobody came out of that conversation angry. And that was great. And that only happened because of the graceful benefit of the doubt, not only mine towards her, but hers towards me. She trusted me to talk to me about it privately and to share some details of what she was having this experience around so that we could have a very vulnerable conversation. And I think that's so beautiful, and it really reminded me that I want to do that more often. I want to give more people that opportunity to self-correct sometimes, but also to explain themselves, because I might be completely misunderstanding them.
And especially in social media. And social media, looking at it from like social media as business, not
Hmm.
social media as town square or anything that's like actually for the people, but social media as a business thrives on outrage and immediate hot reaction.
Yeah, hot takes.
Yeah. It's not a place where it encourages taking a breath and asking, this is my understanding, is this what you meant to say?
Yeah. I mean, I would say it actively dissuades you from doing that. As somebody who is a fairly public figure on the left and in anarchist activism on Twitter, I have definitely had people say, why haven't you said something about this to me? And usually it's because I don't want to get wrapped up in this drama. And this seems like a tempest in a teapot to me. But
And
I just don't want to get involved, you know?
and you only have 24 hours in a day, and you have a lot
Yes.
of projects that deserve and bigger things that's
Tired.
like,
I'm tired and gay.
yes. And there
Exactly.
are things in which instead of addressing the tempest in the teapot, there are bigger tempests that you are dealing with.
Yeah. Or and what happens more and more, I find that my personal work, perhaps because of my areas of privilege and the areas that I have explored educationally of anthropology and psychology and philosophy, my work is to have private conversations with people who sometimes say an outrageous thing and find out where they were coming from
Mm.
and trying to see trying to, I say, aggressively give them the benefit of the doubt, like, which sounds really funny, but this was said in good faith, right? That I think is actually really helpful, because
Aggr-
I've had
aggressive faithlessness.
I've had a lot of conservative men be like, oh, I did mean that in good faith. I can see how that was prickly. Okay, let me take a step back now. And I've been very surprised. I never expect it to happen. I never expect it to work, but it works a lot more often than I ever would have thought.
Okay, great. I want to take that, and can you run me through, and run the viewers through how, okay, so let's say they've got this prickly something, somebody said something that's upsetting.
Yeah.
Maybe it's on social media, maybe it's in private media, or an exchange, a text message, an email, because that's an area where it's when it's in disembodied communication. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so let's say that somebody in a private communication, uh, says something that's upsetting, what can we do? What are some steps that, without, having to get a graduate degree, what are some steps that we can do?
One great example for this is jokes, off-color jokes. And the thing that I always say, if somebody says an off-color joke, is I just say very mildly, I don't understand why that's funny. Can you explain it to me? And I just keep repeating that until they actually have to say the thing that is the stereotype or the bigotry that is underlining the joke. Because once they have to strip away all of the assumptions and say the ugly truth of what the joke is supposed to be about, they generally feel kind of ashamed. And so it's way more effective than me saying, that's outrageous. How could you say something like that? Just say, like, I don't get it. Like, please do mansplain this to me. I don't understand. Why is that funny? And I do the like big eyes and blinking a lot. Like, I just don't get it. Please explain. And I find that most people will realize that they're digging their own grave at some point and be like, yeah, now that I say that out loud, that's not great, actually. Okay, never mind.
Is this an in-person communication or written
No,
communication?
a lot of that's on Messenger. I used to hang out a lot with juggalos, which are fans of the Insane Clown Posse. And I absolutely love them. Like, their ethics are generally pretty solid, but there is also this idea about liking to offend everyone equally that can be something I don't think recognizes power structures and imbalances. So this technique was very, very effective when I was talking to my juggalo friends and comrades of like, I don't get it. Why is this joke funny? And it's like, it's funny because it suggests that like women are weak or women are stupid. Yeah, I can see that that's not really that funny now that I have to say that part out loud. And that was really helpful in helping them think about where it was coming from rather than me giving them that information.
Just off the top of your head, how often did that seem successful?
I would say about 60 to 70% of the time.
Okay. And I'm assuming the other 40 to 30% was like you just can't take a joke.
Yeah, they're just trash. So that's fine. Okay. I find that giving people the opportunity to check themselves and like, is that really what you want to be saying? If they don't get that hint, then maybe they're not a person who needs to be in my life, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Now, in my work on my education side, I'll often get inquiries, say like on FetLife, that the initial cold contact is something that could be interpreted as offensive, right? Mm-hmm. Like, do you need are you looking for a slave? Mm-hmm. No preamble, no greetings, whatnot, right? And if to give a gracious benefit of the doubt, I will try to do this because especially in the realm of sexuality, when somebody finds a place where they feel like they can ask, they blurt out the things. Mm-hmm. And they may imagine what the courtesy and the etiquette of a particular subculture is. So I will respond with, are you asking me personally, or do you want to know how to find the person who's right for you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And oftentimes I'll get sorry, how do I find somebody? How do I find the right person? And then I'll say, okay, like, hitting somebody up like this, probably not a good idea. Here's a format of how to say hello to a person you don't know. And then I like send them a little format,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I've had to unlearn, I was definitely very quick to be like, this person knows better and they are doing this on purpose. And after doing consent culture work for so long, I've realized most people actually don't. Because when they mess up, they get banished from the community. or people ghost them and don't talk to them anymore. They don't actually get feedback on what they did wrong. So they don't have anywhere to learn. Now, on the other hand, like I'm an educator, you're an educator, we might feel a little bit more driven to do that kind of work. And not everybody does. And that's okay. Not everybody has to, like this is sort of a serving the greater good kind of thing. And it does take time and it does take energy and it can be extremely frustrating. So, like, don't burn yourself out on it either.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you can,
Yeah.
see if you can do that, you know?
Boy, you and I and our colleagues, we sure do a lot of free labor, don't we?
Oh, yeah. Well, one way I found around that was I started saying, look, if we don't have the kind of relationship where you and I do things for each other all the time, you can pay me $1 to my Patreon a month to ask me these kinds of questions. Because
Nice.
just that $1, it is not pay for my time, but it is an acknowledgement that my time has value. And having that rule has been super effective in getting people who are acquaintances of mine, but not actually friends, to reflect on, like, I see I am making kind of an intense demand of somebody who I have never done anything for.
Nice. And that is also giving a benefit of the doubt. And we'll be talking about your Patreon in a moment, but that's a way to give somebody a graceful benefit of the doubt by explaining the context by which you do your work.
Yes, absolutely.
So far to review, we have 4 out of 5.
Yep.
We've got asking if someone wants advice, sympathy, or just to be heard.
Mhm.
And I actually have notes because I've been keeping track of this. Stepping up versus stepping back, learning about that. The art of the genuine apology and the graceful benefit of the doubt. So what's number 5?
Number 5 is thinking about daily consent opportunities. And I would say that kind of all the 4 that we've talked about are examples of those daily consent opportunities and are things that I think most of us do encounter in some capacity in our day-to-day lives. So we don't necessarily consider it as an opportunity to move towards a consent culture. We just see it as somebody in our inbox demanding feet pics or whatever.
I have I think I introduced this in like 20 episodes ago. On the first episode, I was thinking about this and I have a silly but realistic example of consent opportunities. That's not about sex.
Awesome.
So, yeah. So if you don't mind,
No, please.
let's see. So let's say I'm going to the grocery store. I go to my favorite little Good Life grocery, in Potrero Hill, and I take my little tote bag, KQED, whatever, tote bag with me, and I'm going to go shopping, right? And I've got the tote bag to put the groceries in because, reusable tote bags. And I do my grocery shopping and I'm talking to my favorite cashier. We're talking about the storm that's coming, you prepared for the flood, whatnot. And as we're talking, and we're familiar with each other, she starts putting my supplies into a paper bag.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm holding my tote bag, and I didn't say anything. She also didn't ask.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just kind of accept it. And so I've got like 2 big bags of paper bag of grocery, and then I've got an empty tote bag. And then I walk out of the grocery store. And as I'm walking out of the grocery store, a pigeon shits on my head. So there I am walking with 2 paper grocery bags, an empty tote bag, pigeon shit on my head. And then I cross the walk, and then there's a person in front of me walking towards me with their phone in their face and on a collision course, about to be on a collision course. And what am I going to do? And I have to make a decision at that point. And now in this brief exchange, in this brief moment in my day, I had consent opportunities and I had situations where I had no consent opportunity.
Yes.
The grocery bag, I missed that consent opportunity. Now, is it a big deal? Probably not, but I missed an opportunity to have a practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I missed an opportunity to wake up the cashier because I'm sure she's tired and she
Mm-hmm.
just wasn't paying attention. To wake us both up, I missed that opportunity. Bird shit, I can't have no opportunity to consent to that. Bird, damn pigeon. No consent opportunity there. Now, as I'm on collision course, and I'm the person who knows that we're on collision course,
Mm-hmm.
I have an opportunity to create a consent or a conflict
Mm-hmm.
or a minimization of myself.
Mm-hmm.
So to the viewers, this is one of my examples of noticing, did I have an opportunity, whether I do anything about it or not? Did I have an opportunity? Did I miss the opportunity? How did I handle the opportunity? Damn pigeon.
I feed my local crows and I worry about them shitting on my neighbors all the time.
But crows and ravens are cool.
They are pretty cool. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. It's a huge
Yeah.
mega flock. So, I
Mhm.
mean, if they start getting into the habit of pooping on people, it's going to be a big issue. It's like hundreds of them.
So folks, consent opportunity comes in those tiny, tiny things. And it's not like you need to be perfect at all of it. Just notice it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I think about I go to physical therapy once a week, and my physical therapist is absolutely lovely. We talk about all kinds of stuff. I am a medical history nerd, and I love to talk about medical history. I listen to a podcast called Sawbones from Maximum Fun that is awesome. It talks all about different aspects of medical history. I started to talk about one aspect of medical history. I think I had just listened to an episode about how pirates deal with bruising. And my physical therapist was doing cupping on my leg. So there was going to be some bruising, which made me think of it. But before I got too in depth about it, I stopped myself and I said, hey, do you want to hear about this? Because not everybody is a medical history nerd and not everybody has kind of infinite ability to handle like grossness that can often come up in medical history that I have. And this is a person who is a professional at her job who cannot leave the room. So by stopping myself and saying, hey, is this interesting to you? Do you want to keep talking about this? It gave her the opportunity to say, yeah, yes, tell me the next thing. Or to be like, actually, can we talk about Thanksgiving plans or whatever, And like, I think that was such a small thing, but it was a way for me to recognize that while this thing was my special interest, it might not be hers. And
Nice.
also she can't leave.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
need to respect what her boundaries are because she can't leave the situation. So yeah, like thinking about stuff like that, thinking about the crows, feeding the crows. I made sure to ask all my neighbors if it was okay with them because it does get very noisy for about a half an hour during crow feeding time. And I wanted to make sure that that was a disruption that they thought was fun and interesting and not something that they were like upset about. And I got their consent before I kept doing it. So it's like these little things that can signal to people, I'm thinking of you too. This is something I find fun, but it won't be fun for me if you're miserable.
Whew. Yeah.
And you
You're a
can't
good,
do that for everything. I mean,
yeah. You're a
like
good
there's moments.
Now, some other time I'm going to pick your brain about the pirates treatment for bruises, but not today.
Oh, God, I will go on and on about it. No worries.
So the good folks who are watching this, either live or in recording, we have 5 ways, 5 little ways, 5 little big ways to be a good human as we move forward. And to summarize that, and I'm going to go backwards so we can remember this better. Daily consent opportunities, the graceful benefit of the doubt, the art of the genuine apology, stepping up versus stepping back, and asking if someone wants advice, sympathy, or just to be heard. And, just kind of let this rattle around in your head and see if, we can get better. I want to get better about it too. Now, we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to find out about a couple of things that I know you're doing, which is that workbook.
Yes.
Tell me about the workbook. What's it called?
Okay, so it's called Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook. And it is a book of 28 prompts. The idea being that if you felt like it, you could do this in a month. And it starts off with 7 prompts. The first week is about your relationship to your own consent. So exploring what consent means to you. How do you advocate for consent? What are some situations where you didn't advocate for your consent? How does social advantages or disadvantages impact your consent? I think I talk a lot about power structures and power dynamics in this workbook, because I think that's an aspect of consent culture that gets maybe purposefully ignored a lot. And it was definitely, when I started using the term 12 years ago, that was an incredibly important part of why I started doing this. So to have that disappear was a little frustrating. So I'm hoping this workbook will help other people begin to think about consent culture, not around sex necessarily, but also in their own ability to talk about consent. And the second week is consent between you and people you're close to, whether that be a partner, your friends, your family, more one-on-one situations. And it goes into a few different ways to think about that, to talk about that. The third week is consent and the community. So your consent practices in a bigger sphere, a less controllable sphere, and what that looks like, and how you can move towards more of a consent culture when it comes to guidelines for events that you're throwing, or even board game nights. I try to make sure to give lots of examples that aren't, again, about being an activist or being a sex educator, or even having sex. Like, I identify as asexual, so a lot of this is about consent in all these other aspects. And then the fourth week is going back to the beginning and thinking about, what have you learned through this? How have your thoughts about consent changed? Did they change? Like, maybe you've just really underlined and defined consent for yourself. The back has a bunch of different resources. The whole book has a bunch of people. I asked members of my various communities to write a short essay on each question. So they give like a personal anecdote of a way that they thought about this question, or a situation in their lives that is related to the question. So that way it's not just all coming from me, because I wanted part of my consent culture work to be giving platforms to other people, because that's part of my stepping back so that other people can step forward. I wanted to demonstrate that there is no one perfect way to implement consent culture, that different cultures have different consent dynamics, different relationships, and that there isn't one perfect way to do any of this.
About this book, the title again, please.
Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook.
And where can people get this?
There should be a link to firestorm.coop. You can also get it on Amazon. I know some people are avoiding Amazon. I support you in that. So I wanted to give another example, another place you can get it from, but you can get it on Amazon. That's cool too. I don't mind.
You'll find the link in the chat as well as the text portion.
Yes, and it's coming out in June 2023. Thorntree Press is publishing it. There's space in the book for you to write answers to things if you want. You don't have to.
For?
I mean, ideally, I hope it's for everybody. I worked really hard to ensure that this book is accessible to everyone, from the greatest generation to Gen Z and younger. So I'm really hoping, yes, you can absolutely share the link for my book. Thank you. um, I'm hoping that it will be something that is accessible to a lot of different types of people. I had my parents read it to check through it because my mom was like a second wave feminist growing up, and I wanted to see if it touched on things that were important to her. I also had one of my best friends who is a staunch libertarian read through it because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't too leftist either. So I really worked hard to crowdsource people reading through this to make sure that my language was as accessible as possible while also not being academic. I really, really wanted to avoid overly staunchy, like ivory tower shit.
I look forward to getting this book. And again, folks, check out Ask Yourself. And you can pre-order this through independent bookstores, or if you need to, Amazon. But you got another way that people can learn from you.
Yes. I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Kitty Stryker, all one word. And I will admit my Patreon has been a little bit quiet the last couple of years as I've been focusing on this book. Though, if you
briefly to people, Patreon, for those of you who aren't familiar,
yes.
those of you who aren't familiar should join both of our Patreons, okay? But it is a subscription-based way to be a micro support or nano support, a way that you can, because many of the artists and people on Patreon can be musicians and poets and game designers and educators, lots of different ways. And what the creators are doing in Patreon is creating their private little universe where they're sharing things and often vulnerabilities as well, and making themselves accessible. I like to think of it as like a backstage pass or a key to the studio.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, so it's a way. And the subscription rates, it's not huge. Usually all the artists, what's your entry?
$1.
Okay.
You could get access to almost everything I do for $1. I think like as it goes up, like the amount of individualized labor I'm willing to do goes up. But thanks to my Patreon, I am now looking at doing live streams every month. I am now able to get the equipment to do a podcast. So I'm thinking about doing like a 10-minute podcast once a month to talk about some aspect of consent culture. So like these little $1, $5, $10 a month subscriptions add up to make it possible for me to make more art without having to spend all of my time pitching articles for pennies to places that want me to flog myself raw for them. So thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You have saved my mental health in a huge way.
And my Patreon supporters have made it possible for me to take time to make this monthly Consent Dojo, because this is not sponsored by anyone other than my patrons.
Yeah, and that's awesome. Like that is like the most anarchist way of creating this kind of media, and you get to feel like you're a cool rich Renaissance person at the same time. You get to be like, I'm helping Michelangelo paint the ceiling, look at me.
And I'm also supporting a whole bunch of other artists with $1 here, $1 there, because I actually want to know what's going on, and I get to have interactions, so it's exciting. I want to respect your time and the viewers' time, and I so appreciate you coming on. Now, to those who are
Thanks for
here
having me.
live, I would love for you to put in the chat about what you thought about Kitty's appearance, and maybe if we're lucky, we might have Kitty back again. So would
That'd be
love,
great.
would love to read your comments. And yeah, big thank you for taking the time on this dark and stormy night.
Yeah.
Stormy night.
Well, I'm really grateful for getting to do this with you. I mean, I've been a huge fan of yours for as long as I've been an adult and allowed to be. So it's been fantastic. This is a topic I'm always interested in. And yeah, it's very emotionally fulfilling.
Yeah. And we're hearing, let's see, I'm just going to read these out anonymously. And love Kitty, can't wait for the new book. I'm on the way to subscribe. Patreon's awesome. Great presentation. Thank you both. Thank you both so much. Love the approach for dealing with off-color prejudice joke. Can't wait to try it. Oh my God, yeah. Let me know how it goes when I
Yes,
try.
tell me all about it.
Thank you so much, both of you. Really enjoyable and informative. And on that note, I wish you a fantastic year, and to the viewers, an amazing year of working on your consent muscles. And thank you all. Have a good night.
Yes, thank you so much.